Welcome to Lancefield on the Line. My name is David Lancefield, and I'm delighted and privileged to welcome Moe Carrick. Moe helps leaders show up. She's an author, consultant, speaker, and a lifelong adventure seeker. Her words, not mine, although I hope that spirit is conveyed in our session today. Moe, you're very, very welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks, David.
Pleasure. You've written 2 books, and I'm going to get the title right because it's a good bit of a teaser. Brave Space Workplace, yeah, making your company fit for human life. And secondly, Fit Matters, how to love your job. You've also given 2 great TED Talks, and we're going to touch on the topics of those too. You live in Bend in Oregon, and you're very welcome. And we're going to dive straight in. We're going to talk about all the easy topics, you know, the workplace, whatever that means now, culture, diversity, gender, the world. And so easy topics, right? Easy topics.
We got all figured out, right?
Of course, well, you have. You're the guest. So you've talked in different shapes and forms around obviously being human, more human at work, right? And if you're imagining a leader in front of you and she or he says to you, "Hey, it's not quite working here. I want to make my workplace, virtual, hybrid, physical, whatever that means, more human." Where would they start? What would they do?
Well, I think for a leader like that, you know, first of all, like a leader like that probably people wouldn't ask the words in that way, like, because I think people think, David, that their workplaces already are good for people, right? I mean, that's sort of like the mindset, like I'm an employer, I hire people, so therefore it's good. I pay them money to do their job. So I'd be like so happy if a leader ever asked me that question. But if they did, I think I would probably say something like, start with you. You know, let's start with you. How do you show up? You know, let's look at your leadership practices. Let's look at your capacity to connect with people. Let's look at your resilience, because how you are, especially if you're head of entity, is mirroring out and kind of rippling out into the organization, and people are copying you at every level. So I think that I would almost always say to a leader like that, okay, great, awesome. You want your workplace to be better for people. Let's look at what kinds of impact you're having, and then let's see about the rest of the company.
That's a great place to start. Yeah. And in that picture of showing your best self, I mean, there's a lot of talk and practice around disclosure, right? How to disclose enough of yourself that people get to know you. And I've seen extremes from hardly any, and people putting on masks, to the other end of the spectrum where it's like you know everything literally from the beginning. In your experience, how do people disclose sufficiently and skillfully in order, if you like, for people to get to know them at a perhaps more intimate level than just their professional selves?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think we are so different, aren't we? Like personality wise, based on how much do we want to disclose? You know, some people are sort of oversharers. Us Americans, for example, you know, we tend to just let it all hang out, you know, not everybody, but some.
Here we go. Repressed Brit. I know.
Well, some cultures are a little bit more reserved, but even, you know, here in the States, I mean, some people, some personalities. I have 3 children. One of them is very private. 2 of them are much more, you know, sort of open around what they share. And so I think we need to be thoughtful about, it's not so much about what we share as sort of what it means to us. And in particular, I'm a fan of, and also a protege of Dr. Brené Brown. I'm certified in her approach, Dare to Lead, and I use her work often. And Brené's research, I think, Dr. Brown's research has really pointed us in the direction of courage and vulnerability being twins, you know, being connected. Whenever we're being brave, we're also being vulnerable. And I think that her definition of vulnerability as the emotion we experience when we're stepping into uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, I think that helps guide us around disclosure. Yes. And, you know, Brené's not the only one who say it. I mean, Patrick Lencioni, for example, talks about trust as the foundational element for team health. And he's talking specifically about vulnerability-based trust. Margaret Heffernan talks about the presence of social capital. Google's Aristotle research talks about teams being healthier when teams know that their team members have their back. That all comes from not so much self-disclosure as from vulnerability. Yeah. So at work, how are we vulnerable? Well, I think it's when we say things like, I don't know the answer, or could you help me? Or I'm anxious. I'm nervous about this project. right? It's those kinds of things that can be very work connected. And I don't have to share the deepest, darkest secrets of my personal life in order to build trust. Although I may, if I'm someone who's comfortable disclosing in that way, I may. But sometimes, have you ever had this experience, David, where you're with someone and they're sharing something that's really personal and you're like, I don't really want to hear the story of your blah, blah, blah.
Has to be relevant, right? Has to be relevant.
Yeah.
And also you have to make a call as to how well you know the person already. So, I mean, I do share aspects of the lessons I've learned with my son. And a few people have said, well, you've shared a lot. And I said, well, if you read it carefully, if I've written something, I've actually shared specific parts that are not too personal to him. He can't at the moment make a call, but I think are helpful to other people going through the same situation. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I have made a choice as to when and how to disclose. And I guess on vulnerability, and I love the definition you sort of suggested there, is that knowing in a way when to do it, and in a way making sure that you're not in a way too vulnerable. Because I remember one person I worked with who'd clearly gone on some form of program or retreat or whatever it was, and he came away and he was asking questions. I don't know anything, and it was too much. And if I go, hang on, you should have a certain degree of credibility and authority, so you need to know
Yes.
something. It's about degree, right? It's about degree.
Yes. Well, totally. And I think about, I was telling somebody this story recently because I have a good example of that, especially as a leader, right? So for me, it was when COVID hit. Here in the States, we started to really feel the impact in late March of 2020.
Yes.
And I think of March 24th or whatever as like the day my business dried up, because it just was like cancel, biggest year ever to zero. And I remember I had a team meeting the day after that started happening and the world was shut down. And I thought, what am I going to say to my team? Like, I am anxious. I am fearful. Like, what are we going to have to close the doors? And I knew that level of vulnerability would not help me
Yes.
or my team to just say, I don't know what to do. I'm scared. So instead, I needed to do some work on my fear, get grounded in my own confidence. And at the same time, I didn't make something up with them. I didn't say, oh, I've got the answers, we're going to be fine. Like, I didn't know if that was true.
Yeah.
So I did say, I'm not sure what this means going forward, but here's what I'm thinking, right? And also, what are you thinking? So I was able to show up vulnerably in that uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, but not create more anxiety. I think they still saw me as the leader on station.
Yes.
And they were like, okay.
And it's a conversation. You're effectively having a conversation rather than either taking it all on your own shoulders, or sometimes you're like putting it onto them in terms of your emotional concerns and so on.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, if you took the COVID theme and if we were being optimistic, let's be optimistic for a while, please, and think beyond the pandemic, whenever it's called, right, and it may go on for many months or years, and you're talking to your clients or prospective clients around how do they lead after the pandemic. What are the themes? And I know every individual is different and every organization they lead is different, of course, but what themes come out of those conversations as to what they either need to start, stop, or change in their leadership style, having learned quite a lot during the pandemic?
Something I've been thinking about and researching about because I'm really curious about it. But here's what's surfacing for me, I think, and based on what I'm seeing in the meta market. I think one is that employees are kind of saying, we're not actually going back. Like, we're not going back to exactly the way it was.
Yes.
Whether that's in the office, if I've been someone who's been working at home, or whether it's with the hours I kept or the long commute I had. There's some pieces that I think the workforce broadly and globally is going to say, wait a second, not everything about pre-COVID work was working.
Yes.
So this interrupt, I think, is going to push leaders to say, okay, what is it we really want to keep? And what is it we do want to go back to? And what is the hybrid version of our future as a workplace that we haven't even envisioned? And I'm seeing this in every sector. In education, how are we going to deliver education? In healthcare, how are we going to serve patients? In industry and in business, what does it look like? Whether we are forward facing, currently working at work or virtual working. So I think for leaders, what I'm anticipating is that leaders are going to come out of the pandemic both with all those questions, like how will we be organized? How will we navigate our spaces? Combined with figuring out how will we more permanently navigate some dimension of remote work,
Yes.
because I don't think we're going to go back to like full-time office. And then also, this is a big one for me, David, I'm sure you're seeing it too. What are we going to do to help heal our workforce? Because people are overwhelmed.
Yes.
Workforce in every sector is stressed. We have more mental health issues than we've ever had before: anxiety, depression, and many, many more. So the leaders on station aren't inheriting a fit, I'm rested, I'm ready to rebuild after the pandemic. That's not what we're getting. We're like limping into potentially the new phase. So I think for leaders, it's going to be a big opportunity to say, okay, what are we going to do to rejuvenate, help our teams be resilient, reconnect, right? Because we've been in isolation, and rebuild our capacity.
There's going to be a lot of, there is already, and there's going to be a lot of trauma and post-traumatic trauma from people who've either had COVID or obviously suffered, from family who've either suffered themselves or lost their lives. And I guess the leaders, it's not just an individual, the leaders will be feeling all the things you've described, exhausted, stressed, burnt out themselves. And yet, I guess some will be either feeling under pressure or under pressure to sort of perform, to sort of, oh, well, we're through the rough part of it. We now need to kick on and, deliver a fantastic performance. And I think there's something about patience with themselves, patience with others. But it also, there's a lot of promises that I think have been made, explicit and implicit promises within the workplace around, as you say, better mental health care, support, more transparency. I mean, I could speak of many leaders who have been much, much more transparent about and vulnerable about what they know, what they don't know, and giving a picture of the organization. That can't just stop, the next day or whenever. I'm not saying there's a big announcement. These things are rarely one big sort of moment. But there is something about being patient, thoughtful, considerate, and actually there's a bit of a long game on the way through it, not just a sudden, right, here we go. We've shut down our offices. This is what we're going to restructure and so on, which I know some individuals have a hunch, I need to do that. It's like, no, you don't. You don't. Be patient.
Right. Well, be patient. And also, yes, because we have transitioning happening in home and community that's really variable. Some countries and some towns and some cities are open and kids are back at school. Some children are still at home, might be for still a long time. Yes. We've got risk factor employees who can't actually enter back into. Yes. So I think that gradation and actually that ambiguity, that turbulence, that there isn't going to be one right answer as we re-enter. So how are leaders going to stand in that? Like it's this and it's this, rather than it's going to be this or this.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I want to pivot, if you like, switch just for a moment, because when I was listening to your TED talk and reading up about you, I do my research. I was fascinated with both talks you gave, but particularly the one around, obviously, your concerns for men, white men. And I haven't heard that narrative before. And I hope viewers and listeners to this go out, and I'll share the links to your talk. It's a mesmerizing and powerful and moving talk. And I want to just quote something back to you. And forgive me that I haven't memorized all of it. I'm not good enough for that. You said, until we as a society support and expect men to be active, attentive, compassionate, careful caregivers, we will never have true gender equity. I have to say, I couldn't agree more. But again, where do you start? Or not where do you start necessarily, but how do you move it along? How do you move it along? What are the sort of levers, mechanisms that you would encourage, maybe politicians, business leaders, people in the community to try and do differently?
There's so much. There's so many places we can start, and yet these are such long, systemic barriers to how we think about work and how we think about gender roles across work. And yes. What prompted me to give that talk and also to make that particular statement that you did memorize, which I'm impressed with, was that I've experienced it in my own life and in my own home.
Right.
So I mentioned I have 3 children. I also have a stepson, and the father of my children and I had a very traditional marriage in terms of some of our duties, and yet my income was always primary, meaning I had more income earning capacity.
Yes.
And what I watched with him was the pain of that and the struggle when it came time to decide, like, okay, somebody should be home with a sick child or somebody should be home with an infant. And we almost invariably, that always often ended up still being me, even though
Right.
my
Right.
money was more important to us economically. So, and I watched him struggle with those identity tensions. I noticed how we tended to avoid the conversation. I noticed what I took on as a Herculean effort of the kind of working woman who does it all, which I see women doing all the time,
Yes. Yes.
exhausting myself. And it was only sadly after we divorced and we had shared custody that I think both he and I started to see, wait a second, I started to see, whew, I don't have to carry all this.
Yes.
And oh, by the way, he can do my daughter's hair and he can manage the carpool lane and he's perfectly capable of cooking a healthy meal. Like, for me to see that and notice that everybody was surviving just fine, and also that they had a unique emotional relationship with him
Right.
that sometimes was eclipsed by my presence as the
I see.
emotional center
Yes.
mother, which is, I
Yes.
think, is the glorification of the mother role. So I think it starts with understanding our own inherited mindset about 2 things. One is making money,
Mm.
and the other is providing care. And
Yes.
for me, it's about, for women, it's about how do we make making money for women, women becoming wealthy, women building wealth,
Yes.
women having ambition. How do we make that okay? And then with men, how do we
And
make,
becoming a norm. Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt, but a norm rather than it being as it often is. And forgive me, I feel as I might be treading on delicate territory, but I'm just going to say what I think. Right? It's too much showcasing, which in some ways is good because there aren't enough role models. I get that, but when you have a wealthy woman, entrepreneur, executive, and so on, sometimes I feel it's just too much. It's like, okay, that's just another person. So what?
yes,
But it's a difficult balance because you do need role models that you can look up to. At the
yes.
same time, you're putting on a pedestal. It's like, okay, she's made a lot of money. Okay, he's made a lot of money. What's the difference?
Well, right, and it becomes an exception too. That's the other thing I notice. Now, on the flip side, though, David, and to your question, we have this social bias of the identity of men that should be about the dedication to their career that supersedes all.
Yes.
And this is devastating, right? And the one of the longest studies, I think I mentioned in the talk, is the Harvard study on longevity, which really interviewed men over a period of 70 years now to discover what makes for a good life.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we know what makes for good life. It's connection to other people.
Mm.
And so then, we have this bias that men, especially senior men that move into leadership positions in business ownership, they often have a stay-at-home spouse who
Yes.
manages everything else.
Yes.
And he gets farther and farther away as his career progresses from the loving, tender connection of primacy at home
Mm.
that every human being needs.
Mm.
And I can't tell you how many men I've spoken with at the point of retirement that say to me, I wish I had blank. I wish I had been able to be more present for my
There
children.
was real
I
regret.
wish I had taken more time. Yes.
Yeah.
And then I watch young men, my own sons, my stepson, for example, men that are in their 20s and 30s who are saying, I want to be a caregiver with my children. I want to be around. I want to be able to take time off. And yet we have, like, here in the States, we have this dynamic because a few years ago, it became more common to give men paternity leave when a child was born or
Yes.
adopted.
Yes.
And we're noticing that most men don't take it, even with
I
the
read that.
policy. So
Right.
what's that about? Well, that's about the pressure they feel
Mm.
that they shouldn't take it, that they can't take it, that it's not for them.
Mm.
She can take it. So I think the work starts also with our mindset about gender role and really expanding
And
how
there's
we
quite a
think
lot of
about it.
courage involved in breaking free. I don't consider myself a role model, but I have given a lot of care and I continue to give a lot of care. And I remember being in meetings where, candidly, a female peer of mine said that actually they were going to dial into a meeting and nobody even blinked an eye. I said I was going to do the same for the same reason, which was I was doing childcare, and there were lots of rolling of the eyes and so on. And people weren't malicious, and it's my previous
Right.
organisation, which I have a lot of admiration for, but it wasn't the norm.
Yeah,
And
totally.
I was, I took it quite sensitively. In the end, what I realised was, obviously, there's a minimum requirement in any role to be present, but I also then have to try and make my choices as to where and how I show up. And candidly, and this, this wasn't actually an issue for me, but if it becomes too big an issue, then you have to make a bigger choice as to where you work, what your career is, and so on. But it requires courage, because you don't see other people when you're talking. I found more affiliation with women on some of these topics about caregiving, childcare, and so on than men. But I think you have to make your own mind up. Ultimately, you have
Yes.
to make your own mind
Yes,
up.
and it does take a lot of courage. It does take a lot of courage because of what you're bucking. And yet I do see young men entering the workforce who are definitely wanting to choose a different way. And
It's changing. Yeah.
it's changing, but it's challenging to have those same conversations.
Yeah.
And also, what do we reward? What are we rewarding in men? Is it only men who have that traditional corporate career that moves them to the top who are valued? What about the man who chooses to work as a garbage man so he can be off at 2 and pick up his children? Or the man who decides to be a teacher, even though he knows he'll make less money because he wants to have summer holidays with his
It's
with his family.
redefining what success is, right, in life, which is often, as you say, all the usual things that has been, and perhaps still is to a degree, money, role, status, and so on.
Well, it's a narrow band of what masculinity looks like, right?
What it
that's what
is, and
Jennifer
it's the
Gosen says.
public, and it's the
Yes.
public bit that you can either brag about or show off about in person, or
Right.
I was going to say cocktail parties, virtual equivalents of that, and social media. But I think at the same time, employees' expectations of leaders have increased, not just through the pandemic. And so if you're a leader who's on a platform espousing a certain practice and you're not doing enough of it, not necessarily you're perfect, enough of it, I think, your if you like, your sponsorship and your support tends to wane pretty quickly. And it's linked to another point around diversity, inclusion, belonging, that easy topic as well. And what I observe here is that there is considerable progress around representation by gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and so forth, and some degree of inclusion, but we're some way away from, if you like, people genuinely, to our earlier point, being themselves, as opposed to candidly being part of the group, being part of the organization. That's the first step. But then being themselves in their own way, rather than having to sort of fit in. We've some way to go. You're living in a different country, you have different experience. What's your take on where we are on that journey?
I think you're right. I think that employee expectations have increased, right? In Brave Space Workplace, I identify 7 things we need from work, and they're not all that different than the 7 things we need from life, right? With a little nuance. But employees are looking at the workplace as not only a place where they can earn their living, but also a place where they can find meaning, where they can connect with others, where they can learn, where they can feel seen. And so that puts more pressure on employers to provide bigger things. But think about how much we're working these days. Full-time employees working more time. They're spending more time working than they are doing anything else.
Yes.
And so the workplace has a huge obligation, I think, to tend to some of those very human needs. At the same time, we're still evolving, I think, David, the structures and the processes that are going to rethink the organization in the ways that the working people, the employees, are going to demand, because some of it's genuinely complex. So for example, just take flexibility as one dynamic. We know entering employees, that's one of their top things that they want. How can I be more flexible? Well, how does that play out if I'm in a hospital environment, I do shift work? Or a manufacturing environment, I run 24/7 operation. How does a leader actually navigate that? There are solutions, but they require a tremendous amount of courage and collaboration to uncover. One example, I had a client years ago who was a director of nursing at a large acute care hospital.
Right.
Shift work. Everybody wanted specific hours. It was a nightmare for her to schedule everybody. So she said, okay, great. You want the flexibility. you all design the schedule together.
Mm.
She had 75 nurses who went into a collaborative process where they designed that schedule every quarter based on every human being in their needs. And she didn't have to do it anymore. How did they do that? With some work, with some commitment, and with some values-driven orientation. So I think the pressures are increasing. I also think that with digital media, we have more transparency. Companies can't hide anything about their practices anymore. And so more authenticity is called for around the real challenges leaders are facing and how to solve them. So I'm hopeful, more hopeful than I have been actually in many years, that we can permanently evolve the way we work. But there's a lot of forces against it.
You talked earlier about your reaction to sort of, the events of March 2020 and how you handled it with your team. If you look over that period from then to now, in the beginning of 2021, what's the biggest shift in your professional mindset, professional practice, or indeed at risk? More widely, you as an individual, what have you changed?
Oh, it's so many things. One is that I've been in the business of gathering for 30 plus years. And I have not gathered with a client in a year. So head blown, right? Mindset blown. I'm like, I can deliver my business without gathering people? Like, who would have thought?
Right.
And it's not ideal and it's not perfect, etc. But I can give a keynote in Switzerland at 7. I can talk to you at 10, and I can work with a local group at 2. Like and I don't have to go anywhere.
Yeah.
So that's powerful for me. And it's causing, my company, I don't know if you remember this, but my company is a benefit corp. So, which represents a commitment to a triple bottom line. And one of the really hairy things about my business has been the fossil fuel utilization, because I and my team fly all over the world, and it's always kind of bugged me. And we've done, paybacks at fossil fuel funds, but it now I'm noticing actually we're going to become much more strategic around when do we really have to be there.
Right. Yes.
And then what are the other models, collaborative models, virtual models that allow us to not be there, which has had, I guess, the other side benefit for me has been that it's a different lifestyle. I've had dinner every night with my husband for 9 months, which that's the most, it's awesome. It's awesome. I love it. And he loves it. And at times it's a little constraining because, we both loved the side of our work that involved travel. And I was just saying the other night, oh gosh, I would love to just go and be with a client at their location and be able to get out of this town. So it's not that I don't miss that, but that's been powerful. But the other thing for me that I've really noticed with my team and with my clients is I am very aware, and you probably are too, we just feel each other better in person.
Yeah.
Like there's a X factor, there's a pixie fairy dust alchemy of presence around emotional intelligence that I'm really missing, especially with my team. Because one of my team members had a baby last year. Another one moved out of the country, big deal stuff. And I can't feel quite as much strong connection. So I think that's one of the things that I'm really missing.
Yeah. I sense that as well. I've reached out to people, not just because I'm in a new chapter of my career and life, but reached out to people in a way that's far more direct and just wonderful, and meeting people I've never met before. And that's probably a limitation on my own mindset, but obviously technology's helped and the shift has helped. But I did a lot of work with execos and boards, and it sounds a bit passé, but when you walk into the room, you can just feel the energy or lack of it, and the tension and stress. And I haven't found the technology yet to help me interpret that over Zoom or Teams or whatever. But if I could, then that would really help. So looking forward then to 2021 and beyond, what are you most hopeful for in the work that you do and yourself? What are you looking forward to?
2 things come to mind. One is that we are launching a new program that starts in June. That's more of a signature model program where we hope to be able to help more leaders really get deep immersion in making their company fit for human life. So that's a virtual program that may have an in-person piece, but it's more intensive, and I feel really excited. It's cohort based, which is some of my favorite pieces of learning, getting leaders with each other. Another is that I have a new writing project. I'm working on a book with a colleague that is about race and women. So she's an African-American writer, beautiful writer, and we're going to be writing about our own experience in partnering across difference. So it's really, we're calling it a business memoir from our two perspectives. Her name is Azure Antoinette. She's a beautiful spoken word poet and also a DEI consultant. And I'm excited to dig into that writing. And it's always, as you know, like it's always daunting when you start a new writing project because it just is. But I'm excited about that one and looking forward to that.
Well, especially the comparisons of your journeys, that will be absolutely fascinating. You often only hear one voice. That'll be fascinating. Hey, I've only written articles. There's a book in me somewhere, but I'm trying to find the right moment. And I know a lot of people during the pandemic have just sort of, their knee-jerk reaction is go and write a book, but you're doing it at a different time scale. And obviously you've done it a couple of times already. I have to say, Mo, it's been an absolute pleasure, privilege. I feel enriched. I love your spirit. I love your candor. We go from sort of, the research, your own lived experience, from the professional to the personal. It's been wonderful. I feel very, very grateful for your time. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you so much, David. So fun to talk to you. And we'll have to do it again. I'm actually launching a podcast of my own, and I would love to have you on it. It's called Work Beyond HR. And it'll be going hopefully up in the next month or two. And I just love hearing what you're doing in the world. Thanks for letting me be part of it and giving me a chance to talk a little bit with you today. Really appreciate it.
No, I'd love to do that. Thank you ever so much, Mo.
Perfect.
That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. Thank you.